You think silence means weakness, but that's because you've never witnessed the kind of silence that comes after someone has felt everything too deeply for too long. There is a moment, and it's almost invisible, when an empath stops explaining, stops defending, stops trying to be understood, and in that moment, something irreversible begins. Because empaths don't go quiet when they don't care. They go quiet when they finally understand. They understand that no amount of explaining will make a blind person see. They understand that their kindness has been mistaken for permission. They understand that being heard is not the same as being valued. And that realization, it doesn't make them loud. It makes them disappear in plain sight. You won't notice it at first. They will still be there, physically. They will still reply, sometimes. They will still smile, occasionally. But the emotional doors, the ones you used to walk through freely, are now locked without a sound. You think silence means they gave up. But what you don't see is that silence is the final stage of understanding, the moment where confusion dies and clarity takes its place with brutal precision. An empath doesn't wake up one day and decide to go quiet. They arrive there slowly, painfully, after exhausting every emotional pathway available to them, after speaking, explaining, forgiving, and hoping far beyond what most people are capable of. They were never silent in the beginning. They were expressive, open, honest to a fault, trying to build connection through truth, trying to fix what felt broken, trying to close emotional gaps that were never theirs to close. But every time they spoke and weren't truly heard, something small shifted inside them, something subtle but permanent, like a crack forming beneath the surface of glass that still looks whole from the outside. They start noticing patterns that others ignore. Not just what you say, but how you say it, when you say it, and more importantly, when you choose not to say anything at all. They feel the energy behind your words, the hesitation, the inconsistency, the emotional absence disguised as presence. And they don't react immediately. That's what makes them different. They observe, they process, they give you chances you didn't even realize you were being given. Because an empath doesn't just listen to your words, they listen to your behavior over time. They track emotional patterns like a silent investigator, connecting dots that you assume are too small to matter. But to them, everything matters. Every ignored message, every dismissive tone, every moment you made them feel like they were too much for simply feeling deeply. And instead of exploding, instead of confronting you with everything all at once, they internalize it. They try to understand it. They try to justify it. They even try to blame themselves for it. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I should be more patient. That's the dangerous phase. The phase where they shrink themselves to keep the connection alive. But awareness doesn't stay buried forever, because truth has a way of resurfacing, especially in the mind of someone who feels everything at a heightened level. And one day, without warning, the emotional math stops adding up. The excuses stop making sense. The justifications stop working. The hope starts to feel like self-betrayal. That's when awareness sharpens. That's when they stop seeing isolated incidents and start seeing consistent patterns. They realize it was never just one moment. It was a series of moments that all pointed to the same truth they were trying to avoid. And that truth hits differently for an empath, because when they realize they've been pouring genuine emotion into something that wasn't being held with the same care, it doesn't just hurt, it restructures their entire perception of the connection. They don't just feel disappointed, they feel awakened. And awakening is quiet. There's no dramatic confrontation, no explosive ending, no need to prove anything anymore. Because once they understand, they don't need your validation to confirm what they already feel. That's the shift most people miss. They think silence means the empath is confused, hurt, or waiting. But silence is what happens when the empath is no longer confused. It's what happens when they finally trust their perception more than your words. It's what happens when they realize that explaining themselves to someone who refuses to understand is a form of self-abandonment. So they stop. Not suddenly, but completely. They stop over-explaining. They stop over-giving. They stop overthinking your actions. Because now they see clearly. And clarity doesn't argue. Clarity doesn't chase. Clarity doesn't beg to be acknowledged. Clarity simply observes, and then withdraws. And here's where it becomes irreversible. Once an empath reaches this level of awareness, they cannot unsee what they've seen. They cannot go back to interpreting your behavior through hope instead of truth. They cannot convince themselves that things will change when the evidence has already shown them otherwise. Their mind won't allow it. Their intuition won't allow it. Their self-respect won't allow it. So their silence becomes their boundary. Not a spoken boundary, not a negotiated boundary, a lived boundary. You'll feel it without them saying a word. The energy changes. The access changes. The emotional availability disappears in a way that feels almost unnatural, because the person who once gave you everything is now giving you nothing you didn't earn, and that contrast is jarring. Because you were used to their openness, you were used to their patience, you were used to their willingness to understand you even when you didn't understand them. But now, they understand you too well, and that understanding has cost you access to them. This is the part that confuses people. They think the empath became cold, but what actually happened is the empath became accurate. Accurate in reading behavior, accurate in recognizing patterns, accurate in protecting their own energy. And accuracy doesn't need noise. It doesn't need confrontation. It doesn't need closure from someone who never provided clarity in the first place. It just needs distance. That's why their silence feels so heavy, because it's not empty. It's filled with realization. It's filled with every truth they finally accepted. It's filled with every moment they chose themselves instead of choosing to keep explaining something that should have been understood without effort. And once an empath reaches that point, they don't go back to who they were before. Because awareness like that changes you. It strips away illusions. It burns through denial. It forces you to see reality without emotional filters. And once you've seen reality that clearly, silence is no longer a reaction. It becomes who you are. You think they're just taking space? You think this is temporary? Something that will pass? Something that will reset like every other time they pulled back and then returned with even more patience, more understanding, more willingness to try again? But this silence is different. This is not distance. This is detachment. And detachment in an empath is not an emotion. It's a decision made after emotions have been pushed beyond their limits so many times that they no longer trust themselves to keep feeling without consequences. Because an empath doesn't detach when they stop caring. They detach when caring starts to cost them their identity. There was a time when they were deeply invested, when your moods affected their peace, when your words echoed in their mind long after conversations ended, when your presence felt like something they had to protect, nurture, and maintain at all costs. They weren't just present, they were involved on a level most people never reach. They felt you, not just heard you. They understood you, not just responded to you. They carried parts of you that you didn't even recognize within yourself, and they did it willingly. That's what makes the shift so powerful. Because when someone who once gave that level of emotional access suddenly goes quiet, it's not confusion. It's recalibration happening at a psychological level you cannot see. They start pulling their energy back, not in a dramatic way, but in small, deliberate ways that add up over time. They stop reacting immediately. They stop prioritizing your needs over their own. They stop trying to fix what you refuse to acknowledge. And at first, you won't notice, because they've been strong for so long that their absence doesn't register right away. But inside them, everything is changing. Their nervous system is no longer wired around your behavior. Their thoughts are no longer centered around your approval. Their emotions are no longer dependent on your consistency. They begin to redirect all that energy inward. And that's where detachment begins to take root. Not as a defense mechanism, but as a form of self-respect. They were forced to learn the hard way, because every time they ignored their own boundaries to keep the peace, they paid for it internally. Every time they silenced their truth to avoid conflict, they felt the weight of that suppression build inside them. Every time they gave more than they received, they created an imbalance that eventually demanded correction. And detachment is that correction. It's not revenge. It's not manipulation. It's not a game. It's the natural result of emotional imbalance reaching a breaking point. And once that shift happens, their entire internal system reorganizes. They stop chasing clarity from you because they've already found it within themselves. They stop needing reassurance because they've learned to trust their own perception. They stop seeking connection where there is inconsistency because they've recognized the pattern for what it is. This is where people get it wrong. They think the empath is being distant to provoke a reaction. They think the silence is a test. They think if they wait long enough, things will go back to how they were. But what they don't realize is that the empath is no longer operating from the same emotional framework. The version of them that tolerated confusion is gone. The version of them that over-explained is gone. The version of them that chased resolution at the cost of their own peace is gone. And what replaces that version is something far more grounded, far more controlled, and far more unreachable. Because now, their energy has boundaries. Not spoken boundaries that can be negotiated or pushed, but internal boundaries that are enforced without explanation. They don't feel the need to tell you what changed, because they already tried to communicate before they detached. They already gave you the opportunity to meet them halfway. They already showed you in countless subtle ways what they needed. And when those needs were consistently unmet, something inside them closed. Not out of anger, but out of understanding. That's the part people underestimate. Because anger is loud, anger is reactive, anger still seeks engagement. But detachment is silent. Detachment is still. Detachment has no interest in pulling you back into the conversation. It doesn't need closure from you. It doesn't need acknowledgement from you. It doesn't need anything from you anymore. That's why it feels so final, because it is. When an empath detaches, they don't leave parts of themselves behind hoping you'll notice and call them back. They take everything with them. Their attention, their emotional availability, their willingness to invest. And what you're left with is not the person you grew accustomed to, but a version of them that exists without needing your presence at all. You can talk to them, but you won't reach them. You can explain yourself, but it won't move them. You can try to reconnect, but the emotional doorway you once walked through freely is no longer there. And the most unsettling part is how calm they are about it. No drama, no accusations, no desperate attempts to make you understand what you lost. Just quiet certainty. Because they've already processed it, they've already grieved it, they've already accepted that the connection they once believed in does not exist in the way they needed it to. And once that acceptance locks in, there's nothing left to fight for. That's why their silence doesn't feel like space. It feels like absence, because it is. An absence of emotional investment, an absence of expectation, an absence of attachment. And you can't rebuild something with someone who no longer feels tied to it. You can't reconnect with someone who is already disconnected internally. You can't revive a dynamic that only existed because one person was carrying it entirely on their own. That's why this kind of silence is permanent. Not because the empath is incapable of feeling again, but because they are no longer willing to feel in a place that required them to lose themselves. And once an empath learns how to exist without that attachment, they don't return to it. They don't revisit it. They don't reopen doors that cost them their peace to close. Because detachment taught them something they can never unlearn. That their energy is valuable. That their presence is earned. That their silence is not a weakness. It is the loudest boundary they will ever set. You notice the silence, but what you don't realize is that you're noticing the ending, not the process that led to it. Because by the time an empath goes quiet in a way you can feel, everything has already been decided internally. There was no sudden switch, no impulsive reaction, no emotional outburst that pushed them away. What you're experiencing now is the result of everything you didn't notice before. Every moment they paused before responding, choosing their words carefully so they wouldn't trigger conflict. Every time they swallowed what they really wanted to say because they didn't want to lose you. Every time they told themselves, it's not a big deal, when deep down it was. You didn't see the accumulation. You didn't feel the weight building inside them. Because empaths don't always show you when they're hurting. They process it quietly, internally, trying to make sense of it before they ever bring it to the surface. And when they do bring it to the surface, it's rarely in a way that demands attention. It's subtle. It's measured. It's wrapped in understanding. They don't accuse, they express. They don't attack, they explain. They don't threaten to leave, they try to fix what's breaking. But when those attempts are dismissed, ignored, or minimized, something starts to shift beneath that calm exterior. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because every time their feelings are overlooked, they learn something. They learn how much of themselves they have to silence just to maintain the connection. They learn how their emotional depth is being handled, or mishandled. They learn that what matters to them doesn't always matter to you. And those realizations don't disappear. They stack, quietly, consistently, unforgivingly, until one day, the emotional equation reaches a point where it can no longer balance itself, where giving more only creates more loss, where understanding more only creates more confusion, where staying becomes more painful than leaving. That's the breaking point most people never see, because it doesn't look like a breakdown. It looks like stillness, a calm that feels unnatural, a quiet that feels unfamiliar, a presence that feels distant even when they're right in front of you. And you might think they're just tired. You might think they're just going through something. You might even think they'll come back once things settle. But what you're actually witnessing is someone who has already crossed an internal line you didn't know existed. A line built from every ignored boundary, every dismissed emotion, every moment they chose to keep the peace instead of speaking the truth. And once that line is crossed, there is no return to who they were before, because they've already done the hardest part. They've already detached emotionally while still being physically present. They've already rehearsed the absence in their mind long before you ever felt it in reality. They've already imagined what life feels like without investing in something that drains them. So when the silence finally reaches you, it feels sudden. But for them, it's been a long time coming. That's why your reaction feels delayed, because you're responding to a change that happened long ago, just not in a way you could see. You're trying to fix something that has already been processed, accepted, and released on their side. You're trying to reconnect with someone who is already disconnected internally. And the more you try to reach them now, the more you realize that the version of them you're reaching for doesn't exist anymore. That's the part that hits the hardest. Because you remember how they used to be, how they used to care, how they used to listen, how they used to stay, even when things got difficult. But what you're facing now is someone who has learned from all of that. Someone who has taken every experience, every disappointment, every moment of emotional imbalance, and turned it into a boundary you can't see but can definitely feel. And that boundary is absolute. It doesn't bend. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respond to apologies that come too late. Because by the time you're ready to fix it, they're already done fixing it alone. That's why their silence feels so final, because it is built on completion, not the completion of a conversation, not the completion of a conflict, but the completion of their emotional investment. They've already given everything they were willing to give. They've already waited longer than they should have. They've already hoped in ways that stretched them beyond their limits. And once that level of effort goes unanswered, something inside them closes in a way that doesn't reopen. Not out of bitterness, not out of resentment, but out of realization. The realization that staying in a place where they are not fully seen, heard, or valued is a form of self-abandonment they are no longer willing to participate in. So they leave. Not always physically, not always immediately, but emotionally, completely. And once an empath leaves emotionally, everything else is just a matter of time. Their responses become shorter, their presence becomes lighter, their attachment becomes non-existent, and you can feel it, even if you can't explain it. Because the energy that once connected you is no longer there. And no amount of effort now can recreate something that was lost through repeated neglect. That's why this silence carries so much weight. Because it's not asking for attention, it's confirming absence. It's showing you without words that what once existed has reached its end. And the most difficult truth to accept is that by the time you feel that loss, they've already made peace with it.